There may be something more important for our long term, something more disruptive that could be sculpting our long-term economic growth. And what if the real crisis isn't too many people on Earth, but too few? You've said that it's one of the greatest long-term risks facing the global economy.
Replacement fertility rate. China is now actively losing people every year from its population. We're on the track to probably peak somewhere around 2040 and then start declining. And how far we go down, how low it goes, nobody really knows. It's never really happened.
How do we reverse this trend? Is it even possible? Or is this just the new way of the world?
Probably the new way of the world. The answer on whether or not there's an obvious solution to this or is an easy solution, there is not.
I'm concerned that this is going to create a significant downtrend in Canadian real estate values. How does this play out economically? When do you think we start to see the fertility crisis show up in asset valuations? Before we get started, this isn't financial advice. Know your risk tolerance, do your own due diligence, and speak to a financial advisor. All right, so welcome back to another pod. While everyone's talking about tariffs, Trump, debt, and geopolitics, there may be something more important for our long term, something more disruptive that could be sculpting our long-term economic growth and how we function as a society. That is population collapse. It's a threat that is often overlooked, but it's starting to get more and more attention these days because, in my view, it's extremely pressing. I look at the situation from a few different perspectives. There's two sides to this, and what if the real crisis isn't too many people on Earth, as many environmentalists contend, but too few? Darrell Bricker has been ahead of this shift for years. He's the global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, co-author of the book Empty Planet, a world-traveling demographer who's spoken with presidents, policymakers, the middle class, and the urban poor alike. Darrell also formerly led research for a Canadian Prime Minister. Needless to say, he's someone who digs into the data. And his present warning is that declining birth rates will reshape our economies, societies, and of course our investments. If you've watched my pods in the past, you know the fertility crisis is a subject of great concern to me. So I've been really looking forward to this one. Darrell, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me on, Aaron.
Let's jump right into it. I don't think there's any way to get into this one softly, but I think this is the greatest crisis facing humanity probably in several hundred years. You've said that it's one of the greatest long-term risks facing the global economy. It's far bigger than anything like inflation or any current geopolitical conflict. I agree, but why are so few in power these days not really focused on it? Furthermore, why aren't we as a society sounding the alarm about the fertility crisis?
Well, I just think it's one of those things that there are tropes out there about how the global population is out of control. It's such an ingrained part of the way that we look at the world. I mean, even if you watch the Guardians of the Galaxy, Thanos is getting rid of half of the universe's population because we're overusing all of our resources. I'm not saying that, there aren't resources in the world that aren't being overused, but if you think it's because of the size of the population, you really need to think again, because we're on the track to probably peak somewhere around 2040 and then start declining. And how far we go down, how low it goes, nobody really knows. It's never really happened. We're the only species in the history of the world that has just said, I really don't think that Darwin guy was correct. Maybe we don't need to create the next best version of us. We'll let somebody else do that. And the problem is, of course, a lot of people are letting somebody else do that right now.
I agree with you. Culturally, there seems to be this guilt, at least in the media. It's like, if we have too many people, we're going to destroy the planet, we're going to blow up the planet or make it so uninhabitable. I think Elon Musk said, you could fit everybody into a single family home on the entire planet in the state of Texas. So it's not that we're running out of space. You've traveled to half a dozen continents while researching for your book, Empty Planet. Was there a common theme as to why people weren't building families like we used to? Like, did you find a common denominator?
Yeah, it's capitalism. I mean, it's basically that we've moved into a society in which the family doesn't operate like it did. The reproductive imperative doesn't operate like it did. Religion has declined. So if you're not doing it for your God, your state demanding that you do it in order to support the military, any of the other reasons that we used to have kids before, that people just don't feel they're as important in their lives. And what it's done is it's created this path of existence particularly for women, in which if you're going to participate in the capitalist economy, and this is why I mentioned capitalism, in which you're going to be a wage earner, then you probably have to get an education. And if you have to get an education, that means you delay family formation. And when you take that education to a longer period of time, say not just a high school education, but a university education or a college education, you start delaying all of these decisions in your life. And when you start delaying them to long enough, they start actually interrupting your ability to create the number of children that you want to have in your life. So I'll just take the average, and I'm sitting in Canada today, so I'll just talk about Canada, but it's pretty well representative of what's going on in the Western world. The average Canadian woman used to get married around the age of 20, 21 back in 1960, when we had the peak of our fertility, which was about 4 children per woman. Now the average Canadian woman gets married around 30, if she gets married at all, and probably has 1 kid, maybe 2, but more likely 1. So we've just reduced our fertility rate by half in under 100 years. And if everybody's doing that same kind of thing, and by the way, around the world, that's exactly what's happening, then all of a sudden, kids aren't being created. And when kids aren't being created, the population ages. And when the population ages, it's less capable of reproducing itself because we only reproduce ourselves the old-fashioned way.
Being in Canada as well, I think anywhere in the Western world, a lot of media headlines say, oh, it's the cost of living, you can't afford to raise a child, and so forth. You know, I don't know if I buy into that argument, but you're saying it's more along the lines of it has to do with the trend of women joining the workforce, getting higher education, pursuing a career, and then just biology in itself if you start having a child at 30.
Really what it is, Aaron, when you want to sum it up, it's culture. So we've created a culture, particularly in the Western world, in which we value all of the things that you just went through, and having kids is not part of it. And as a result of that, we're having fewer. So we've created an economy in which the incentives are the ones that require you to delay everything. And as a result of that, the culture is that we've adjusted to having smaller families, which is what we've done. And there are extreme examples of that in places like China today, Korea, Singapore, places like that, in which the fertility rate is below 1. Now, just so your listeners understand, to have just a population that replaces the number of people that die every year, you need to have a fertility rate of 2.1. That's enough to replace yourself, your partner, and a little bit extra for people who don't produce children in their adult life. They don't live to adulthood. It's even higher, by the way, in terms of fertility rates, replacement rate fertility rates, in places like India, where it's 2.4 or 2.5, because the infant mortality rate is so high. In order to just have like 2.1, you have to have people making these decisions a lot earlier in their lives. So in Canada, where you and I are sitting, the fertility rate this year from Statistics Canada is probably going to be around 1.2. In China, it's 1. In India, it's 1.9. So the 2 largest population countries in the world are China and India, and both of them are below fertility rate, replacement fertility rate. China is now actively losing people every year from its population. So this is the trajectory that we're on.
I was having a conversation with a friend about this the other day, actually. He's pretty sharp. And he was saying it's culture too. It has nothing to do with affordability. Yeah, it's harder. It's more expensive to raise children. But he said it's culture. I mean, he said, you know, if you look online, you go on social media, what do you see? You see pretty self-absorbed lifestyles. You see people going traveling, buying expensive lattes, and pursuing a career or going to the gym. So whatever it may be, it's all about them, just them. And then those that have a natural nurturing instinct in them, which I think is the majority of human beings now, automatically seem, especially young people, say sub 30, their new kid is a dog. Instead of having a kid, they'll go out and get a dog and treat the dog like a kid. So, you know, I think culture does have the majority to do with this downtrend, and I only see it getting worse. I've seen stuff on social media about people talking about how kids are polluting the earth. Having more kids is damaging to the earth. Like this is the type of low conversation that's going on online about kids. I know there's a lot of positive too, but it's just, this is unfathomable 25 years ago to think that people would have this kind of mindset, young adults, right?
You know, it's wrapped up in a conversation about affordability, for example. And you mentioned this before. The truth is, if you make kids free, would we have any more of them? I mean, really, that's the question. And the answer is probably not that many more. And the reason is because there's countries around the world that have gone in on this, like places like Hungary, and where, you know, if you have 2 kids in your 30s, you won't be paying taxes for the rest of your life if you're a woman. In the Nordic countries, which have gone further along on this than anybody in terms of work-life balance and making sure there's gender equity in the workplace and respecting parental rights, whether it's fathers or mothers. Childcare, you know, is basically free. They've done everything that you can do, and all of them are below replacement rate and declining.
And obviously there's people who can have kids and who want to have kids, but I can't imagine the, people waking up at 60 years old, if they were able to have kids and being like, I made the right decision not having kids. I just think there's going to be a big regret down the line. But to your point, if you made it free, would it really change the trend? I've seen what Hungary's doing, and I think Poland's going in that direction as well. But I guess my biggest concern is, how do we reverse this trend? Is it even possible, or is this just the new way of the world?
Probably the new way of the world. And, there's really three groups around this, Aaron, because it's going to be mitigated through the political process at some point. But there are three groups that are forming. One of them is the degrowthers, and you probably heard a lot about them. They're the Greta Thunberg type people who, there's too many people on the earth. We're despoiling, all of Mother Nature's gifts, and the fewer that we have, the better. So they're actually celebrating this. This is a good thing. And then there's another group of people, and they're the people who tend to be in government and politics and academia, the smarter people who think about these kinds of things, and they kind of have a liberal view of things. And I don't mean that in a left-right kind of way, but just, fairly open-minded, scientific-based view of this. And their view is, if we just get the incentives right, people will do the right thing. So, for example, if you make kids free, well, people will have more kids. Or if you made childcare free, people would have more kids. Or if you got rid of the motherhood penalty in the workplace, people would have more kids. And they probably would, but they wouldn't get most countries back up to replacement rate. So that's the second group. And that's where everybody is fixated right now, finding the right government instruments in order to reduce the market failures that are associated with this. So putting in place the right incentives. They're right, but none of it really works. And then there's the third group, and you're seeing these emerge, and these are more like the Elon Musks of the world. And it's a combination of people who are the techno version of this, combined with people who have very traditional values. So there are communities in the world that do have quite high birth rates, and they tend to also have high rates of religiosity and religious observation. So, the Mennonites, the Mormons, the Orthodox Jews, people who are in those types of communities tend to have more kids. So their view is if we just got back to that version of the world that we had back in the 1940s and 50s when we had the baby boom, this would all solve itself. And then you've got the tech types saying, and we'll make it easier for you because we'll develop technology that can make this happen. So there's this third group. And you see them, interestingly, in American politics all kind of popping up. So there's the net zero guys who are the degrowthers, and then you've got the liberal technocrats, which are all about expanding public spending in order to support these things. And then you've got this third group, which is like Elon Musk bringing his kid into the president's office. Yeah. The reason he's doing that is to try and normalize the presentation of children in all sorts of different types of environments. So you're going to see all of this play itself out in a political kind of way. But the answer on whether or not there's an obvious solution to this or is an easy solution, there is not.
That's my concern. I look at our current scenario, and just putting culture and values and societal issues aside for a second, let's talk economics. I look at this trend and I see incredibly deflationary potential for land values to correct significantly. I also see an issue with investment strategies. Like how does this play out economically? When do you think we start to see the fertility crisis show up in asset valuations and economics?
Well, it depends on the country that you're in right now, but there are places in which this is happening, like Japan already, which loses about 1 million people a year. There's a reason that they're struggling to find economic growth. The issue on this is that everybody gets very fixated on kind of the easier part to fix, which is the production part. So they worry about the labor force, they worry about whether or not we'll be able to create replacement means of production other than the workers that we have. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit on this. The real issue is going to be consumption, because not only is the population getting smaller, so the net consumption is going down, but the population that will be left will be older, which are not big consumers of products and services. That while they are big consumers of government services, but not things like all sorts of things that you would do associated with business or production. They're not doing those things. So that set of things, that the productive aspect, is not as big a worry for me as the consumption one. Because even if you were able to reduce all of that productive capacity, you still have to have people to buy the stuff that's being produced. And that's what we're losing. We're losing that younger consumptive part of the economy. It's declining, and it's declining every year.
Let's start with real estate, because to me, that's the most obvious. Like in Canada in particular, there's a culture here it's a real estate obsessed culture. And so you hear politicians today talking about, oh, there's a housing shortage. You got Carney saying he's going to build 500,000 homes. The government has to get back into the business of building homes. I don't necessarily agree with that at all. But I think actually when I look around, I'm in Calgary here, we have real estate in the city, and I look around and I say, I don't think there's actually a housing shortage. I think we might actually be on the path of overbuilding, especially given kind of the retraction on our immigration policies, or going back to normalized levels. At some point, because we're not having enough children in this country, and that seems to be a problem with many countries in the West and even beyond, immigration is going to become a very competitive industry. Canada's always had the luxury of people want to come here from China or India. There seems to be an endless amount of people who want to come, so it's never been an issue. But eventually we're going to start competing with England. Eventually we're going to start competing with Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so forth. Many other countries, the US. I'm concerned that this is going to create a significant and long-term downtrend in Canadian real estate values. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do. And you combine that with what's been happening as a result of COVID, and particularly in downtown urban environments, it's a problem. I've got lots of friends who are in the real estate development area, and I tell them these kinds of things, and their mentality is still in 1975. We're on this endless path of growth, and the truth is we're not, particularly in downtown areas. I think, towns that are more adjacent to cities are where the population growth actually is. So if you look at where I am in Toronto, downtown Toronto loses people. It doesn't gain people, but yet you see more and more towers going up because the city is addicted to the development fees that are associated with these new condos, and the condo market here is really soft. And the reason is because, a combination of things. Immigrants aren't coming in to the same pace that they were. People who are starting families, people who are in that stage of their life, actually don't want to live downtown. They want to live out in the car commuting suburbs. And then downtown, those condos that we were forced to live in because we had to be close to where we worked, if you're able to come into the city 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week, maybe your commuting distance is further, and maybe commuting is the appropriate substitute for living in a downtown skybox. I mean, we have all of this view. I mean, it's usually the urbanist view, and it's also the real estate developer's view, which is the ideal life for a person is going to be a person in their mid-30s who's affluent, who has a condo downtown and is perfectly content with raising their kids there. They get in their condo on the 25th floor, go downstairs, they get on their bicycle, and they pedal off to their office where they sit in their Spark zone and their open office concept. And this is the ideal life for nobody.
Yeah.
Nobody. It's what you have to put up with when you don't have a choice. And as a result of that, a lot of these assumptions are going to be challenged. Places like downtown Toronto and downtown Calgary, to a lesser extent, because the population is younger and you do attract a disproportionate amount of immigration still in the province of Alberta. But all of the Canadian cities are all going to be struggling with this. And at some point, the birth rate in places like India, below replacement rate, China, well below replacement rate. China is going to lose half of its population this century. It's funny, I'm listening to all this stuff about the struggles between Xi and Trump and what's happening with the United States. And it's like, you want to take on China, just wait.
Yeah.
Just wait.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to lose half their population, and what's going to be left is going to be really old and incapable of reproducing itself. They don't have a national pension system. What are they going to do? And the scary part is that's what really makes China dangerous.
Right. Kind of backed into a corner. Just kind of circling back to Canada, how do you see this playing out? When we look at the fertility crisis, we look at immigration in this country, at what point does Canada's population start to trend downward, do you think? Is this like a 10-year thing, a 20, a 50? What is it?
It'll be this decade. So if immigration continues to be controversial and governments continue to peel back on it, the only sources of our population are that and population aging. In fact, the biggest source other than immigration and Canadian population growth is people not dying as fast as they used to.
Yeah.
Back in the 1920s, the average Canadian lived to the age of 57. 57. Now it's 82. But there is an end date on that, and the population is aging quite rapidly. So immigration can substitute for it for a period of time, but the problem that's associated with that is the cultural and political aspects of that and how difficult it is. We're not bringing in people from places like Italy, Portugal, the UK and others, because those populations are in the same situation that we are. I mean, Italy loses about 50,000 people from its population every year. So does Greece, so does Portugal, so does Spain. So those Western Europeans that used to come here and settle, or even Eastern Europeans that used to come here and settle, there's fewer and fewer of them. So we need places like Asia. Asia is going through exactly the same thing. Now, the Indian population is young, and we're going to still have access to that, but their birth rate is low. And by the tail end of this century, they're going to begin to population decline too. So that leaves Africa. And the issue with Africa is that, yes, you can cream skim the population there and bring in the doctors and the well-educated engineers and the rest of it from there. But after that, you get into people where literacy is a big issue, social cohesion is going to be a big issue. Their ability to actually contribute to the Canadian economy in the short term is not going to be strong. It doesn't mean over a period of time that they won't be able to, or maybe them in their lifetimes or their descendants after that can make a contribution, but it's a fairly big transition. So immigration isn't even the answer. It's the answer in the short term, but not in the long term.
Yeah. It's not a fix. Yeah, exactly. So what do you think? Is this a situation where we have to rethink, capital allocation, how our economy works? This isn't even a big real estate channel, but real estate is something that I feel like everybody has in common. And it's one of those things to me that seems like the most obvious asset to fall in value in Canada over the next, call it decade to 20 years.
Depends on where and what it is. I think if you're in the office real estate game, you've got big issues.
Yeah. What about housing?
I think on the housing side, if you're in the condo skybox business, except if you can start convincing older people that is the ideal place for them to live, and they start leaving their single family homes, because that's one of the biggest problems that we don't even talk about in real estate, is that older people are aging in place. They're not selling their homes. They're staying right where they are, and they're leaving 3 bedrooms empty because they want to be in the neighborhood they're in. They want to have access to the doctor that they see. They want to be able to visit with their friends and do all of those kinds of things. But they're the obvious target actually for those towers, not younger people. And we've got to make a cultural change there where people feel that they need to turn over their real estate sooner. But that's a really big cultural change. So yeah, if I'm in the office business, I'm worried. If I'm in the skybox condo 500 square feet starter situation for young people, I'm worried because there isn't as many of them as you need, and the student population is going to decline because of what's happening with immigration. If I'm got a house in downtown Calgary, or I've got a house, standalone house with a yard and that kind of thing in downtown Toronto, Edmonton, or any of those, I'm actually feeling reasonably okay about that. We did a survey. It's on our website, and anybody wants to go take a look at it at ipsos.com. The preferred housing style of Canadians. What kind of house do they see as ideal? And it's that.
Detached home.
Yeah, this is why it drives me so crazy in Toronto, where I am, where it's all about trying to support, people who are living a lifestyle that only a small group of the population wants to live, which is, like I said before, my condo or my apartment in, an old Victorian house in which I drive to my, office or wherever I'm going, my community service organization on my bicycle, and all the infrastructure is going to be created to support that life. And it's like, there's hardly any of those. There's hardly any of those. So the question is, how can the real estate stock that we have now be accommodated to what our population is going to be, which is smaller families, older families, and people who are looking for 4 walls, a yard, and a lawn.
With all the city municipalities and their zoning laws, the single-family detached home is becoming a rarity. It's becoming a collector's item.
And this is the strangeness of what's being proposed on, building 500,000 houses, or you can take any political parties. Oh yes, we're going to create number of houses. Number of houses is what an economist thinks about. Does anybody want to live in a prefab box?
Exactly.
Something that looks like an elevated refugee camp? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So please stop talking about numbers. Yes, there's an element of that, but there's a certain type of house that people are looking for, and we need to build supply to meet that demand, rather than what some urban planner thinks is best for the world.
Absolutely. I hear this talk about modular homes and all this, and, Carney's, not to bash Carney, but he's, saying we're going to do this, we're going to build modular homes, make it affordable, blah, blah. Nobody wants to live it. Exactly. And who wants to live in a glorified trailer park?
Yeah, market starts with you. Move yourself, your wife, your kids, all into that kind
Absolutely.
of house. And all your family. All of you should live in that. We'll have Carney Park.
Yeah, exactly.
Polyev's proposing similar kinds of things. We'll do the same to you. Just go out and do surveys. They're not the aspirational homes for Canadians. Remember what a home is to a Canadian. It is not just an investment.
It's a sanctuary.
Yes, but it is also a marker of middle-class achievement. That's the problem. You want to know why young people are voting for the Conservatives? Because this country doesn't work for them. Wonder why old people are voting for the Liberals? They're trying to hang on for what they remember. That Mark Carney, Mike Myers, ad that they did prior to the election, it was like 2 guys talking about Canada in the 1970s, which is the one that they remember. That's not Canada today. It's nostalgia. And we've got to break out of that nostalgia and understand who we are and what we need. And that is not what it is anymore. I read a whole book about this called Next, which is what the next Canada is going to be like. And I talk about this. And what I do is I compare the Toronto Maple Leafs and going to a game and then going to a Raptors game. And you look at the NHL, that's old Canada. Still got the organ.
Yeah.
And then you go to a Raptors game and it's a completely different audience, completely multicultural, a complete representation of who the new Canada is, the new Toronto is, actually. And you see the difference. But we're still stuck on Mike Myers and Mark Carney in sweaters, neutral. They look like Detroit Red Wing sweaters, but neutral sweaters. At what is that old Toronto Maple Leafs game? And the old elbows up. That's Gordie Howe. That's like the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
That elbows up thing, I can make fun of that all day. I'm not going to.
I respect the sentiment, though. I respect the sentiment, the idea that we need to stand up for Canada. But those symbols, it's like, guys, it's 1970s.
No one knows what it means under 40.
Tim Horton was still alive.
Look, I feel like this election, I'm an old millennial, early 40s, but I feel this election is millennials versus boomers. I don't know if that's too broad brush, but when I see kind of the people who are supporting the Liberals and Carney, it's all kind of, senior citizens or, let's call it 60 plus. And then when you look at the people who are outspoken online or even, in my community, I mean, Alberta's a bit of a bubble. We're pretty conservative, but all the young people here are conservative that I know. And so I feel like this is creating a pretty big wedge between young and old in Canada, which I have never seen before. But it also speaks to the frustration of, I think, the wealth gap between the boomers and their children, right? I guess what I'm getting at is, from what I've seen anecdotally online and in my social circle, is that kind of what you're seeing in the polls now? It's kind of a boomers going liberal and young people going conservative?
Well, they're not absolutes, they're tendencies, right? So it doesn't mean that every boomer is voting for the Liberals or every young person is voting for the Conservatives. But we are seeing a different demographic distribution. So traditionally what you see is younger people supporting more progressive options and older people supporting more conservative options. Not absolutely. There are mitigating factors, like older university-educated people tend to be more oriented towards progressive options than people who, say, for example, went to college or just have a high school education. This time around, what we're seeing is younger people being more likely to vote for the conservative options and older people more likely to vote for the progressive options. So the Liberals and NDP, but the NDP have just about disappeared. So it's mostly the Liberals. But it's especially younger men. So if the only people voting in this election campaign were younger men, Pierre Poilievre would be comfortably ahead. So that is a distribution we've never seen in Canada, but we've certainly seen it in other parts of the world. More of a, I would say, Western world type of a phenomena than it is even exclusively a Canadian one.
There's a lot going on right now about the validity of a lot of these polls online, right? At least in some side, at least people who are pissed off that Poilievre's not dominating anymore. Obviously, Ipsos excluded from this, but what do you think about the argument that these polls are skewed, they're calling landlines or whatever? Is there any validity to this? And no young people have landlines anyway. Are these polls indicative of reality, or do they have a bias in them?
Well, you can have a poll that is out of line, but all of the polls, generally not. And if you take a look at the record of polling in Canada, particularly in federal elections, it's pretty darn good. I mean, particularly in the last two elections in which the popular vote was won by one party and the actual election was won by another. That's a pretty tough diamond to cut. The polling industry did a pretty good job of doing that. When you're outside of election periods, you can get a lot of fluctuations in polls, and the reason is because public opinion isn't really that settled. You can get different results based on when you're in field and that kind of thing. Different methodologies have different types of biases, but most of the pollsters are pretty good at ironing out those biases. But I do find it incredibly interesting that when parties are ahead, the polls are all that, and when they're behind, all of a sudden they're crap. They can't be both. I would say in this election campaign, there has been some dramatic swings that we've seen that have been unprecedented in Canadian politics. We've got Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives going from 25 points ahead to, in our latest poll that was out with Global National today, in which the gap is now 6 points to the Liberals. Still down 6 points from where they were the previous week, though. The race is tightening up.
So, you still have the Liberals ahead by 6?
Yeah, and everybody does have the Liberals. I think there's one poll that have the Liberals ahead by 2. Unless you see more, it's probably an outlier. What I would say to your audience is that don't just look at one poll, look at all of the polls, look at the average of polls, and that'll probably give you a pretty good sense of where the race is. Now, when you're in an election campaign, public opinion is fairly dynamic. And when you're particularly in modern elections, you can get pretty big swings. So things can change from one day to the next, depending on what's happening in the news. In the old days, political campaigns, I'm old enough to remember the old days. Basically, most people had their minds made up before the election campaign. And all the campaign did was reinforce what they thought and convinced them that they were right to think the way that they did. And there was a bit of fluctuation between one party and the next by election date, but it wouldn't be a lot. Now it's just these wild swings. So the polling does a pretty good job of capturing it, but it depends on when it's in field. And by the way, landlines, there are some polls that do that, but very few do. I mean, most of them, if they're doing telephone, they do probably 70% cell phone and 30% landline. I mean, grandmothers still answer landlines and do need to represent them because they vote.
Yep.
But most of the polling, including ours these days, is done online. It's done with panels of people who've decided that they want to participate in doing surveys. So we do a combination of the two. So we know that there's some biases in online surveys and there's some biases in telephone surveys, and they tend to balance each other out. The current average right now, I would say, in the polling is all pretty close to what we have. Some have the Liberals leading by 4, some have them leading by a bit more. Some are around the same number that we have. But right now, I would say that the average is around 5 to 7 for the Liberals. Last week, it was more like 10 to 12.
Jeez. It's funny, you talk about, back in the day, most people had their decisions made. I've never switched party, provincially, federally. I think I'm a pretty vanilla voter. I have my core issues. I have a libertarian stance in me, so I tend to go with the party with the smallest government. But it surprises me that there's such a big cohort of Canadians that can be swung. Is it as big as it seems? It seems like it's like 25% of the population can go from like NDP to Conservative, it seems.
Yeah, and they have. Well, it's usually these days the NDPs, other than in provincial politics, the NDP at the federal level is pretty much a spent force. It's better to look at it as progressives and conservatives, and the progressive coalition is bigger. It's kind of like 60-40. And the reason the conservatives tend to beat the progressives when they do beat them is because there's two parties for progressives rather than one. The challenge is really big for Poilievre in this election because not only is he taking on the traditional Liberals, he's also dealing with the fact that the progressive vote has collapsed into one option. Even given that, he's still, in our polling, like I said, six behind. But he halved the lead over the previous week. It seems to be moving into a tighter election right now. And even, the Poilievre is trailing the Liberals by 36. I think the Conservatives got 34 in the last election. So he's actually doing better than what they did previously. So it's an atypical kind of election. What's been happening, though, is it's really overly focused on the question of leadership. It's not Conservative versus Liberal. It's Poilievre versus Carney. Carney has uniquely positioned himself as the single best person to deal with Donald Trump and the United States and all the fallout from that. And as long as the election is focused on that, it's hard for Poilievre to play. But what's happened over the space of the last week is that as Donald Trump has moved his trade and tariff policy specifically off of countries like Canada, so it's no longer you're the 51st state, Governor Trudeau, all of that kind of thing. We're going to use my economic force to, buckle you to your knees. And as long as it's not specifically about that and it's more general, which is basically what's happened over the last few days, it's more of a general global kind of thing and tariffs in general rather than Canada specifically. What that's allowed to happen is for people to kind of back away from that issue a little bit and go back to where they were before, which is focus more on the issue of cost of living. Those two issues are integrated. If it's characterized as cost of living, the Conservatives have an advantage. And if it's characterized as dealing with Trump in the United States and international trade, Carney has an advantage.
It's interesting. Do you think...
It's not easy, Aaron. It's hard.
Yeah, no, it's a very fluid situation. I look at this election, I'm still kind of in awe. Like the biggest thing for me, and again, I'm in Alberta, so I live in a bubble, but I think Quebecers and Albertans are the most politically engaged people in this country. They're both kind of at odds with each other, it seems. What do you think Carney, if let's just say it plays out as the polls suggest, Carney wins, he's the next prime minister. You're a data guy, but what do you think that does for national unity? Because I can tell you out here, the stuff I hear, it's not good for national unity for the West in Ottawa.
Yeah, I think we asked the wrong question. on national unity. So we ask about Western sovereignty. I don't think that there's really a very strong base of support. And we shouldn't talk about what the West. It's really the Wests. I mean, Manitoba's not
Right.
Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's not Alberta.
Yep.
Alberta's not British Columbia. Two provinces in particular, Alberta and Saskatchewan, they're really not happy with the way the federal government, particularly a liberal federal government, treats them, particularly for the last 10 years, and they're concerned about Mark Carney. I think the real question in the West is not whether they would break away and form their own country. I think the real question in the West is if they would break away and become an American state. And I think that's the one that's the most dangerous. Quebec sovereignty is not the same kind of thing, because the idea that Quebec would break away from Canada simply to join the United States and have all of their cultural imperatives even more imperiled doesn't really seem very realistic. So the real issue for me, thinking about national unity going forward, a potential significant breaking point for Canada could be a big enough campaign in those two places that where they would not consider forming their own country, but they would consider negotiating joining the United States. Not unheard of. This has happened in Canadian society previously. It happened before Confederation. So the idea that we could have a national unity crisis is very different from the one that we've experienced in the past. It's a special leadership challenge for Premier Moe, Premier Smith, and if Mark Carney does win the election, Prime Minister Carney, and one that no prime ministers ever really had to deal with in the contemporary times. All of our national unity issues before have been related to Quebec. But I will say some of the biggest patriots, Canadian patriots, are actually in Alberta and Saskatchewan when you go out and you ask about national pride. But we did a survey prior to Trump making his announcements back in December after he won the election. And we asked Canadians, if you could have full U.S. citizenship and you could have all of your assets valued in American dollars, would you vote to join the United States? 30% of Canadians said yes.
Yeah.
50% of Gen Z. That's our problem. It's not Western sovereignty. That's our problem.
Interesting. I was speaking to someone about, they were asking, what reasons do you vote for? Like what? I said, well, there's a few, but if I were to put the foremost reason I vote or what motivates me to vote for such party, it's my wallet. And they're like, well, how can you say that? I'm like, well, look, I don't look to the government to instill values in my family. I look for them to protect property rights, protect our borders, make sure, our citizens are safe. But my primary objective when I vote is to have a small government and lower taxes. And the person I was speaking to was so offended by that, but it was like, look, this is the reality. And to speaking to your point about the percentage of people who would, particularly young people, who would opt to join the U.S. if their assets could be denominated in U.S. dollars, I mean, I'm not surprised. I think Canadians historically have been economic voters. No, have they not?
Yeah, the economy tends to be the big issue on the ballot. Not always. Back in 2019, when Andrew Scheer was facing off against Justin Trudeau, no, climate change was a really big issue. And the reason is I picked 2019 very specifically because we're going to remember those as the good old days when you had time to think about it, when you had time to think about that. I mean, 2021 was about COVID and all things related to that. This election, it's going to be more economic, either of those last two elections. In 2015, Justin Trudeau was actually able to move the Liberals ahead of the Conservatives on who's best able to deal with the economy. He had a new economic promise, right? He really, they did an excellent job of running that campaign. And Stephen Harper was managing what was technically called a recession, turned out after the election not to be one. It's hard to argue that you're doing a great job managing the economy when Statistics Canada is telling you that we're in a recession.
I look at the good old days in Canada as 2011 when Harper got his majority. Now, he did some things after getting his majority that I was like, okay, but I wasn't too happy about. But last thing on Canada and your polling, but what are you seeing on energy infrastructure? Obviously, this is a core issue to the country's economy now, particularly with Trump's looming tariff threats. Is that something that people are favoring now, particularly in the East, in Quebec, that they would want a national energy corridor or pipeline? Like, is there a chance of actually building one?
Philosophically, yes, people are in support of it. There is probably a better chance now getting it done than any time in my adult life. Because basically energy companies, any resource companies, forestry, mining, anything that you want to look at relative to the Canadian economy, it's been an uphill struggle for them for years, particularly against people who are more environmental in terms of their outlook. and also in terms of Indigenous issues and dealing with those. But there seems to be a willingness to consider those kinds of things. So I would say at a philosophical level, yes, that there's more of an open-mindedness about it right now. What will be interesting is to see when somebody decides to put a shovel in the ground in the province of Quebec. That's when we'll see whether the philosophy becomes reality.
What's the big beef in Quebec? Is it just is it environmental? Is it no, we don't want to let Canadians push us around, we're a nation? What is their issue with pipelines? I don't get it.
It's quite simple, actually. Their view of the future of energy is the one that they have, which is James Bay and hydro. That is what they regard as kind of their almost their national asset. And as a result of that, they just don't know why people, for example, in Alberta why would we need your oil and gas? Of course, they don't think about how they drive. They don't think about, how oil and gas products, petrochemicals are used in our day-to-day lives. It's just a philosophical thing. And particularly in Montreal, the climate movement's actually quite strong. Downtown Montreal is like downtown Vancouver. So that's the issue. It's this idea that Quebec doesn't get anything out of this. It's just for Alberta. It's dirty. It's not good for the environment. Why would we do this? We've got all this clean, wonderful hydroelectricity. We don't need any of it.
They need better education on the transfer payment system, but I'm not going to get into that. I like to leave on a positive note. What are you optimistic about economically in Canada for the next 5 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually think, just circling back to what we were just talking about, I think we're now in a situation where we potentially could have more of an adult conversation about what our economy really is. Stop pretending like we're Silicon Valley North. It's all about, super clusters and all this other stuff. And start remembering that, we're sitting on our biggest assets, things that people need, the food that they need to eat, the critical minerals now, particularly seeing what's happening today with China and critical minerals with the United States that our potential trading partners need, the oil and gas products that we have in places like Alberta, but not exclusively in Alberta. We have natural resources that we could harvest in an environmentally responsible and ethical way, in a way that no other country in the world could do. Hopefully we end up having people in government, particularly in Ottawa, who are attuned to that opportunity. We spent 10 years with people who are in a fantasy world, to be honest. I apologize for any of my liberal friends, but it's just like, let's accept the reality of who we are. We're not going to be, the energy superpower created by, solar power and wind. Please. Anybody who thinks that that's going to work in this country doesn't know how those systems work.
Yep, I agree.
We've got plentiful oil and gas. We've got lots of hydroelectricity. We've got lots of minerals, and we've got lots of forestry products and agricultural opportunity that, if done in a really respectful to the Indigenous communities, done in a way that's respectful to the environment, we could do it in a way that could be a model for the world. So let's get focused on what's real.
We are the best diggers in the world. Like, there was a time for many, many decades where our geologists were the most sought after in the world and would travel all over the world to help other governments and companies with their projects and mines and so forth. We've kind of lost that title. I think the Aussies are now dominating in that regard, but we can get it back. And I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial and very opportunistic Indigenous communities as well who want to get in on it, natural resource extraction and production and transport as well. So I think I agree with you. I think the country now is paying attention to this important matter. And I think no one will say it, but we have Trump to thank for that, in my view. Wrapping up, Darrell, this has been a great conversation. Where can our viewers find you online? Tell us a little bit more about what you do at Ipsos.
So I'm the global CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. So we are active in 44 countries. We have about 1,500 staff. I just happen to be Canadian and live in Toronto. And we do public opinion research, but basically use data to help people find solutions to understanding what the public wants to try and make the world a better place is essentially what we do. In terms of trying to find me, probably the place that I'm most active is on X, so at Darrell Bricker. But also I write a lot. You mentioned Empty Planet, so you can read that. But I have a new book coming out in the fall. I'm writing again with John Ibbotson from the Globe and Mail called Breaking Point, which is about all of the issues that we were just talking about. The future of Canada, where our country needs to go.
Excellent. I'm sure it'll be another great read. Darrell, thank you very much for your time today. You've given me a lot to think about, and our viewers as well. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.